Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the MedTech Essentials free webinar. This is Adnan Ashfaq, your host for today, and today I'll be talking about equipment software validation. So we've been on a journey for the last 4 months. We've been talking about various subjects within validation. We've been covering process validation, an overview which we'd covered previously in our first month. We also then went on to cover qualification in a more general sense. We looked at IQ, OQ, PQ. Last month, we then started to look at packaging validation, sampling and statistical validation, and also sterilization validation. So today we will be looking at the importance and more of a balanced approach of software validation in processes in equipment today. That's what we'll be covering. And over the following few months, we will also then be looking at MedTech Essentials as a journey throughout the whole process of medical device development. So this webinar is being recorded as usual. And there's also an opportunity to ask any questions for anyone that comes in within the hour that we'll be speaking. So without further ado, I'll move on, and we're going to be looking at the software, the more of a balanced approach within software validation. There's lots of different approaches that are taken specifically in the medical device industry, which is taken from the pharmaceutical industry. Lots of those practices have been adopted within the medtech space. So generally, where are computers and automated equipment used? So within medical device design, laboratory testing analysis, production, inspection and acceptance, labeling and packaging, production and process control, traceability, document control and complaint handling. These can be lots of systems within medical device development, which has taken place, and then also more specifically in production, which is where some of the bigger challenges lie ahead. So these are some of the areas that we have to have a look at. Now, within the software development lifecycle, most people will be familiar with a very typical V model, which starts off with a contract, which would be based on some user specifications, which would then allow the development of some software specifications to then be developed. There'll be a high-level design and then more for detailed design, which will then lead on to the coding, which would then require unit testing, integration testing, system testing, and then acceptance testing. And then, of course, the warranty that is coming from the manufacturers. So this is a typical V model, which is used in the software development lifecycle. And this has to be quality assured all the way through the entire process of the development of the software within the equipment, which is going to be tested. So the purpose or the benefits of software validation are to assure the quality of device software and software automated operations. It reduces long-term costs, decreases failure rates, recalls and corrective actions, also increases the usability and reliability of the device. And of course, ultimately, we're looking to reduce the risk to patients and users. And of course, this reduces liability to device manufacturers. The source of this comes largely from ISO 13485. So there are two specific clauses which we'll have a look at. One will be clause 4.1.6, which specifically requires the organization to document procedures for validation of application of computer software used in the quality management system. Such software applications shall be validated prior to initial use and as appropriate after changes to such software or its application. The specific approach and activities associated with software validation and revalidation shall be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software. Records of such activities shall be maintained. So some of these, for example, could be your quality management system. If you're using an EQMS, that can also be spreadsheets, which you might be using, which are used in complex calculations where there may be some algorithms or code that you're using. Lots of other, also design software. I see there's a question here. Most of the time in medical device design Creo software used. So in this case, whether the license copy of this Creo version is sufficient with the compliance per US FDA. So that's very important when, if you have, of course, a license copy should be used, but then you have to then apply it through this system when we're looking at the regulations. So just going back to this slide, which I had in the beginning here, wherever automated computers can be used, which could be, in some of this could be within the medical device design, because I think Creo is used for device design, as you've said. So you have to make sure that you follow the same process that we're about to have a look at now. So as I said, 4.1.6 covers those types of software, whereas 7.5.6 looks specifically at the validation of processes for production and service provision. This is quite a large clause where it requires the organization to validate processes for production, where this is seen to be more as your process validation. But it's the next slide, which I have it continued, which this is the second part, is just because it was too much text to put onto one slide. I've broken this down into two slides. So it's a continuation from here, 7.5.6, where it talks about these bullet points. The ISO says that the organization shall document procedures for the following, and it mentions criteria, equipment qualification, methods, statistical techniques, records, revalidation and approval for changes, but then also that the organization shall document procedures for the validation of application of computer software used in production and service provision. Such software applications shall be validated prior to initial use and, as appropriate, after changes to such software or its application. The specific approach and activities associated with the software validation and revalidation shall be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software, including the effect on the ability of the product to conform to specifications. Now, this is so important because there's nowhere in ISO 13485 that tells us how to conform to this requirement. What specific guidelines should we be using in order to meet this requirement for software validation? So we'll come on to that. We'll come on to some of the practices. Equally, so FDA also in part 820.70 mentions that about automated processes. When computers or automated data processing systems are used as part of production or the quality system, the manufacturer shall validate computer software for its intended use according to an established protocol. All software changes shall be validated before approval and issuance. These validation activities and results shall be documented. So this is a very short paragraph in comparison to clause 4.1.6 and 7.5.6, which essentially is covering the same, but in greater detail in ISO 13485. And most people will be now familiar that the US FDA are now adopting the QSR as the QMSR. So therefore, ISO 13485 should be followed even for FDA purposes. Also, there's an FDA software guidance document, which you can find in the public domain on the FDA website, which also looks at applying software used as a component, part, or accessory of a medical device, software that's itself a medical device, or software used in the production of a device. So we're not interested in the first two, but definitely the next two, the software that's used in the production of a device and software used in the implementation of a device's manufacturing quality system. These are the two areas that we're covering in this webinar. The former two will be covered at a later date when we will be looking more at medical device software itself. So we have to, as you can see, it talks a lot about risk, about a risk-based approach. We always begin with a risk assessment. We will then write a user requirement specification, or if it's already an existing validated process, we will then look at change control for existing equipment. We will also look at writing a factory acceptance test protocol if it's applicable. We will write a validation plan or include the software approach in the equipment, and also then perform an IQ, OQ, PQ, and then document the summary report. This is a very basic format of validation. It's not looking at the details, which we'll come on to, which have a more challenging approach, which is why we're trying to look at this as a balanced approach, which in terms of the FTA, we will call that least burdensome approach. So now moving on to the approach itself, we, of course, because we're looking at a risk-based approach, we're looking at the classification of the medical device. So is the device class 1, is it class 2, or is it class 3? So the level of validation will be determined by also the risks by the software that's being posed within the medical device. So I see another question here as below is software qualification in case of medical device, in which guidelines we need to follow, whether GAMP, or FDA Part 11 or EU Annex 15 and any other ISO standards. So yeah, that's a very good question. So I'm coming on to that now. So this is what I'm going to discuss in these next few slides. Annex 15 is used more for pharma. So we're not looking at the pharma practices. We're looking more at GAMP 5 and 21 CFR Part 11, and also some other approaches as well. So as I said, we're looking at this risk-based approach. The classification of the device, generally class 1 devices are low risk, class 2 moderate risk, and then class 3 would be high risk medical devices that would require more intensive validation and verification and more testing to prove the manufacture of the device and the software that's being used has been controlled and mitigated where the risks have been posed. So we talk about GAMP, and we mentioned GAMP 5. Because GAMP is not a regulation or it's not a standard, it's a guidance that's used in the industry. I know there's been specific cases within my own experience where an FDA auditor preferred to look at the FDA guidance over GAMP. This is specifically in the medical device industry. We're not really looking at pharma practices here. There is, if you look historically where GAMP came from, well over 20 years ago, the evolution of GAMP to the point that we've got in GAMP 5 now. The original GAMP came from ISPE, which is the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers, that developed GAMP as a good automated manufacturing practice in the pharmaceutical industry, where there's lots of heavy automation which is being used, and software such as clean in place or steam in place processes, or tablet machines which are manufacturing pharmaceuticals, where there's heavily involved in software where there could be risks posed. So the ISPE came up with GAMP. It was quite about 20 years on. It was then 20 years ago or so. It was then adopted within the medical device industry. And when I first joined the medical device industry, it was being used into the medical device manufacture, where they were using lots of packaging machines and lots of automation that was being used in the manufacture of medical technology. So GAMP is something that I've been familiar with for well over 20 years. So GAMP 4 looked at 5 categories at the time, and then the most recent version, GAMP 5, removed category 2, which was related to firmware. So there are now 4 categories that exist in GAMP. So those 4 categories are category 1, 3, 4, and 5. They didn't renumber them to 1, 2, 3, and 4. They just took away firmware. The pretext being that there could be firmware within any of these possibilities, so there was no real requirement to have firmware standing alone on its own. So you would then look at each of these categories, and you might have firmware that you need to deal with, especially 3, 4, and 5, not so much the operating systems. So these definitions are still the same from what they were from previous revisions of GAMP. So some of the examples here for GAMP 1 would be operating systems such as Windows or Unix. GAMP 3 is probably one of the most common categories that's used as standard software packages, which is commercially available off the shelf, such as statistical analysis packages, any software within lab instruments such as HPLC, those sort of things you would apply. And then also then configurable software packages would be GAMP4, where you might have things like SCADA, LIMS, or ERP packages, which are used for manufacturing resource planning. And then the most difficult of the categories is the custom bespoke software, and that's probably a category that you want to try and avoid as much as possible, if that's possible, to purchase off the shelf or software which is configurable only software rather than custom. Now, there's lots of needs where you actually have to have custom bespoke software, and that could be where you've got such as the examples that I mentioned about clean in place, or a controller for a custom built machine, which is customized to your specific requirements. Then it will be difficult to go into category 3 or 4. So beginning with the risk assessment, I will use a risk assessment approach which differs from GAMP traditionally. It's looking at things a bit more creatively and looking at things holistically. So you would perform the risk assessment based on the category of software. We start off with the 1, 3, 4, and 5 that we mentioned. We would look at the intended use of the software and then look at any risks from the software. So we would do a risk assessment, a risk analysis on the software itself, of what it's doing and what is a worst case situation, looking at severity and impact, and then looking at detection, looking at the probability of the likelihood, and then looking at detection. So we look at those 3 factors, and then we would come up with an aggregate score, which would then multiply these 3 points. So I'll just move on. I'll show you some of the points that we have to have a look at when we're looking at software criticality assessment. We look at data criticality. So is there critical data within the software which is intending to use or manipulate, or is using it for administration? So any reference point. So the CTQ means critical to quality. If it's making a critical to quality decision, you have to have a look at that, and that could be either a low risk or a high risk. So to try to keep things simple, I try to look at things from a perspective where there's only low risk and high risk. Anything that's a high risk could be data that is required by a CTQ, a critical to quality decision, and held by the system as master data. So that can be things, for example, specific software code which is driving something. That can be critical data, as opposed to the other example, it might be just administration data that can be low, which is just taking some information from a user, which would be a low risk. But I'm not going into cybersecurity at the moment. That can be high risk and low risk depending on what information you're looking at from cybersecurity. That can be stolen information or user passwords, and this type of thing can be quite high risk. But so we have to look at the overall data that's being presented, or whether that's low or high. Then we look at the probability of the risk. We look again at whether it's low or high. If the system has only yes or no types of entries and no decision making needed. So you could be, let's just say, have some kind of spreadsheet, and you have some algorithms within or software in the spreadsheet, but you only have like a checkbox which you're answering some questions, and the answer is going to be yes or no, and that's quite simple. The risk for there would be quite low. Whereas on the other hand, if you've got something which is data which can cause real inaccuracies by you entering that, and if it can be manipulated, if it's not been coded in, hard coded, then this can present to be a high risk. So we have to have a look at the probability of that risk being manipulated. So that's looking at the second point. The third point, then we'll look at detection, and we look at whether there's any warnings or no screen warnings, or anything that can be picked up that could be on a display that could prompt the user. There might be an alarm or something that's indicating that would be a low risk, or high risk would be if there's errors or not obvious in reports, query, or data usage. So that would be a high risk in those cases. So then what we do is we then look at those 3 factors, the data criticality, probability, and detection, and we look at this table that's used on an aggregate scoring. If anything that comes up with a high, then we have a course of action that we need to take. And if it's low, then we have a different course of action. So we're looking at if it's a high, high, and high, the aggregate risk will be high, and so forth. If it's a low, low, and low, the aggregate risk will be low. And then the permutations basically mean that if there's anything which has high data criticality, the overall aggregate risk will always be high. And then on the other side, you can see that the only circumstance where there will be a high aggregate risk on the lows of data criticality is if you have a high probability of risk. So that will basically mean that there's the likelihood is quite high of something happening. Then that means that there's a further course of action that needs to take place. So low risk generally will be no software validation required, or there might be some other checks that you have to do, but no software validation. And if it falls under the high risk, this is when we need to then take the course of action with software records. We need to then do things like data backup, risk prevention strategy. We then need to look at the outputs and inputs, whether we look at a black box test strategy or a white box test strategy, which we'll come on to. So that's looking at the overall strategy of how we define the risk scoring. So it is quite different to the approach in GAMP, which can sometimes be very burdensome. And the reason why this has been done this way is because many startup companies don't have the resource to perform the overall tasks, which are very complicated via GAMP, which almost assume that the organization has a large resource that can perform all of these tasks. So we have a look at a middle approach. This is why we call this a balanced approach, to look at everything risk-based. We're not ignoring GAMP. We still take on some of the GAMP guidelines and the specific approaches and templates, which are very good, and the specific testing. But we then need to have a look at the specific documents that we will complete if we're following a least burdensome approach. If we're looking at a more balanced approach, we start with a user requirement specification, which has to have the individual needs of the equipment against its intended use. We would have things like health and safety requirements, operational requirements, management requirements, any training needs, any user and technical documentation requirements. We'll use that then to check against a factory acceptance test. If the system is more complicated than just a simple system, there may be more complex functionalities. We would then be looking at a functional specification from the supplier. So that the functional specification is basically a response to the user requirement spec. So we provide the user requirement spec to the manufacturer. The manufacturer of the machine then provides a functional spec and says, based on your user requirement, this is what we've understood, and this is what we will be supplying you. So in terms of software needs, the equipment must also then look at any software backup requirements. How will this be performed? Any audit trail? Will any printouts have any initial date timestamp tracing back to the user? Security, how will this be password protected? How will access be restricted? Will the program be protected by the manufacturer and locked down to prevent access by any user, to prevent software manipulation? Is there any need for software to be supplied on an external support, or will it just be done by cloud or on an intranet system, etc.? These are obviously various factors for consideration. And then for URS, we'll also be looking at a traceability matrix that will trace all the links to the documentation from the trace to the ID code and any links to the code. So then if we do a factory acceptance, this is obviously going to be optional, very dependent on the type of equipment. We would be looking at things like specifications, contractual arrangements, and then looking for quality compliance and performance. We would do that based on the agreed URS. We would then define a number of tests that will be performed to challenge the system. We usually, the thing is that you do a factory acceptance test normally before the equipment is being released for use, or the software is being released, and then that's your last chance to make sure that it's what you're receiving is as you expected it to, and any issues should also be resolved before final release. So we would write a validation plan, and then in the validation plan, we would have an overall purpose and scope of the software validation. You would define the URS requirements, outline the validation strategy. How did you come up with this level of validation? The approach that we're taking, that we discussed, the risk assessment. You're using part of GAMP or not GAMP, all of GAMP, etc. This is your validation approach. You would outline the risk assessment strategy, define roles and responsibilities. So when you're doing roles and responsibilities, you might have an IT function, packaging, validation engineers, a validation leader, quality would be involved, and these are the different functionalities and purpose of what would be taking place. So moving on into the nitty-gritty of software validation, I mentioned black box testing, which is a typical method of looking at the testing, but then you have white box testing, which is when you have a known internal code structure. The black box is an unknown internal code structure, and then the gray box testing is when you have partially known internal code. So if we're doing white box testing, the tester should have full knowledge of the internal workings of the application and tests, which should be based on the internal structure. It's used in customized solutions. So the GAMP 5 that we looked at would typically be white box testing. The source code should be programmed. Machine vendor should be looking at the specific requirements and the user requirements. And then that's when you would most likely have a functional specification, design documents, a copy of the program, training of the code, the specific code method that's used, and also copyright if it's needed, and the relevant documentation. So in terms of definitions, so FDA define white box testing where necessary validation information is not available from the vendor, and that's when you will do a black box. And then you would look at using these in intended use. But you would have, for white box, you would have code-based testing, which is known as a structural testing on a white box. It's identifying test cases based on knowledge obtained from the source code, detailed design specification, and other development documents, and then looking to make sure that the testing has been completed, and then there would also be debugging and fixing any source code errors. And then you would be looking at, for example, validating the test, validating individual components. Those tests would be independent and isolated, so the results don't affect the other tests. Also ensure that the software components are functional and ensures that the code is behaving correctly. Now, so like I said, so white code testing would it's not the most common. Black box testing is what is much more common, and that's when the tester does not know the internal code, and that's where you then challenge everything based on inputs and outputs. So you might have menus, and then you press something. There's a process that takes place that you don't know about because it's black box, it's encoded. Then you would look for a desired output, and then you would record the results. So that's when you look at the functional testing. You look at the complete program, you look at challenge tests, and you would write out a script. So an example would be in the same way you would have a system test. You would validate the entire system. You would have components used together under typical and extreme conditions. Also, you would be looking at ensuring you're meeting the outlined requirements and that the software interacts correctly with hardware. So moving on to the third category, if you've got grey box testing, that's when you have partial knowledge of the internal workings. Testers may have access to some source code and system design documents, but not the full internal workings. So that's when you would then do some performance testing. You would validate the software to ensure it meets performance requirements, and then measure how well the software performs under various conditions. You might have things like test response times, load handlings, stress handling in that way. So we would then move on to the IQ, OQ, PQ once we've got the functional specification, factory acceptance done, user requirements all been logged. You would look at then performing IQ, OQ, PQ. This has been very well defined in the FDA guidelines on general principles of process validation, and also the FDA's glossary of computerized system and software development. IQ, OQ, PQ is sometimes not very well understood by many software professionals. So it's making sure that there's any installation that's required. So that's where you would verify that the software has been installed correctly according to the manufacturer's specifications and that all required components are in place. So for example, you'd have the system installed without errors, confirm that the installation process is followed by an appropriate procedure, and then review system documentation and specifications. So then we would move on to an OQ once we've successfully performed the IQ. That is done to ensure that you're verifying that the software operates as intended in its target environment and performs according to its functional specifications under normal conditions. So examples, you would do things like functional testing of the software features. You might have a heavily automated system which is sending signals to a mechanical component, which is, say, opening and closing a gate on a conveyor belt, or it's removing something. It might be a robot, which is sending a signal to. So those would be functional tests that you have to do, which are initiated from the software. You would then need to have a look to see if there's any errors and bugs. And then, of course, we also need to see if there's security measures that are implemented correctly to prevent the software code from drifting or creating other bugs. And effectively, those errors then would lead to a malfunction of the output. So, for example, if it's saying open a gate to reject some samples on a conveyor belt, it might not open at all, or it might close at the wrong time or open at the wrong time, and there's going to be a system error. So those are typical things that you would be looking for. So when we get to PQ, you're looking to perform this, verify that the software performs consistently and reliably under real-world conditions, including the actual operational environment and user scenarios. So that's when you have to make sure that the performance testing is done under load conditions, stress testing, and making sure that it's done over a long period of time. So it's not just a short period of time, but it's being done over a timeline that gives us some level of consistency and confidence over time. Any acceptance criteria that we define has to be very specific. The software must behave according to defined specifications. It should be within acceptable limits. The software should function under stress or peak loads without crashing or malfunctioning. The software must also meet security standards and protect data from unauthorized access. So that's where you're looking at things like cybersecurity and penetration, and it could be user challenges or access. Your username and password that could be challenged, that also needs to be tested. And then also it has to be easy to use. That could cause user error or confusion. And that's another thing about usability, looking at usability. So in terms of documentation, we do a validation plan to provide a roadmap. The user requirement specification defines the requirements. The risk management file records risks or potential risks. The test protocols then define the pass-fail criteria. The report then documents the test reports, if there's any deviations, any failures, anything that needs to be rectified, and then the final validation report needs to be written up. So moving on to off-the-shelf software. So if you have off-the-shelf software, which is mostly the case with lots of equipment, and if it's possible to purchase off-the-shelf equipment rather than customized, that will be the least burdensome approach in terms of what you have to document. And hopefully you should be able to have lots of this information supplied by various others that are supplying the information. So they would supply the equipment supplier would then supply the documentation for use. That could be operation manuals, troubleshooting manuals, etc. So that's very important. Where necessary, validation information is not available from the vendor, the device manufacturer will need to perform. So that's when the black box testing becomes even more important. the device manufacturer should also consider implications for continued maintenance. So, well, obviously, we also have to have a look at maintenance and ongoing use, right through to the termination of the equipment. For some of the off-shelf software development tools, there can be also you might need to have compilers or editors or operating systems involved. That can be a very lengthy process. There's a big validation effort that needs to take place. Things with the commercial softwares may have bug lists already, that they've already performed some of this testing, which is very useful to have. And then developing that whole test script is very important to make sure that it's accurate against the software. Then we move on to customized software. That's when, as we've said before, you've got software which is maybe constructed either by coding or programming or assembling together previously coded software components in a new application. So coding is the software activity where the detailed design specification is implemented as source code. Coding is then the lowest level of abstraction for the software development process, and it's the last stage in decomposition of the software where module specifications are translated into a programming language. And then also coding usually involves use of high-level programming language, and it needs skilled individuals that have this familiarity and they have experience with debugging in specific coding languages, which is a really high skill involved in itself. So once you've done the coding and the debugging, there can be a rigorous level of error checking to make sure that the software is still operating and that there's no further errors in the code. And then you might need to make justification and then mitigate those risks within the code. So also then doing some kind of traceability analysis is also very important within the specification. So looking at the requirements specification, looking at functionality specification, any design within the software, and then what testing you've done to make sure those requirements have been met. This is a very typical format in design development in medical devices. We use traceability matrices in many different functions, and there's no difference in design of equipment where you would expect to have requirements laid out at the beginning, and in the very end you'd have some level of testing to make sure that the requirement meets its initial objectives. So then when we are doing validation in design phases, we should look at different aspects. So as I've mentioned before, you would look at validation, analysis, verification, but also changes in the design. And this happens quite common, especially if you've got a very complex piece of equipment, which is taking a lot of time and you have to work closely with the suppliers. If it's being a customized machine which is being developed, you might have to have a change control system also being used. So you typically, in your own quality management system, you can use your change control system also to document a piece of equipment that's going through factory acceptance testing, officially signed off, but then you need to make some changes in the equipment, and then you should use your QMS for this. There should also be design reviews. Again, this is assuming that you have a slightly larger project and more complex equipment. I certainly wouldn't do any design reviews for simple off-the-shelf equipment. This is, again, only restricted to more complex systems. So if you've got software plans, which documents that you were planning to achieve, you would look to discuss these in a design review meeting, what was planned, what was achieved, and the verification results and test results and any changes that need to be made would all be discussed at the design review. There should also be a vendor auditing that's taking place. So this is typically in part of your quality management system under supplier evaluation, supplier vendor or onboarding. There should be some process that takes place which allows the official auditing to take place. So this is just as part of your supplier audits. I also wanted to share some examples of warning letters from the FDA. These are 483 observations. I think some of them are actually quite old. And then you're looking at here you've got an example where there's been 483s based on no controls on integrity of raw data, lack of traceability, overwriting of existing data, files not secure from loss. Deletion can be done by anyone. There's no backup procedures. There's publicly available passwords. One operator uses another one's ID. Ex-employees still had access. There's no audit trail. You can change, delete, copy, anything. So these are really, really bad examples that we should never be performing anything like this. So these are things that you should have written into a procedure somewhere for equipment software validation or spreadsheet validation, which controls this. So moving on to spreadsheet qualification itself, which is also administered under software validation. The FDA also have some really useful documents. There's a specific useful document, an AAMI document. I will try to post it later on if I can find the number. It's an old document which the FDA have as a guidance document, which has some really good examples of spreadsheet validation at the back as in the annex. Spreadsheet qualification, spreadsheets are used all the time, and so we very often just neglect this. I've just been involved in doing a QMS audit earlier on today, and I found a spreadsheet which was used by my client, which didn't look like it had been locked down. So I have questions whether the spreadsheet has been validated. So spreadsheets need to be validated just in the same way as software, especially if you've got complex code in a spreadsheet, which is automating something. If you have got some calculations which are used even for lab testing, you need to make a call and a decision based on risk that if even in the design and development stages of a medical device, you may use an R&D Excel spreadsheet to make calculations which could have an integral impact on the safety of the device by the calculations that you're using in the formula, even at the R&D stage, because that's going to eventually be built into the design of the device. And if that's not been locked down and controlled, then there can also be some integral problems of manipulation of incorrect data, and that can then lead to a further risk. So this is why it's very important to also look at the formula, look at user access to the spreadsheet, look at password access, lock down the cells. Where there's free text, make that free text available only to the person that has access to the spreadsheet, but then also define those controls around this. So in terms of spreadsheet qualification steps, some of the things that you should do is the user would draft a proposal for a new spreadsheet, including the description of the problem that the spreadsheet is aiming to resolve, how it's handled, and how the spreadsheet can then improve the efficiency. What the system owner is collecting, the inputs from the anticipated users, and then writing the requirements. The programmer would then define and document the required functions. The functions are then reviewed by users. The programmer then develops design specification, for example, the formulas, and then the location of the inputs and the output cells. For complex spreadsheets and for spreadsheets, you can also have VBA scripts. So we tend to think as Excel is a very simple tool, but in fact it can be there can be lots of scripts that you can run in Excel that can make it automated. If you're using macros, for example, they will be automated. You can use that, and that also needs to have software validation. Now, we're not talking about clause 7.5.6 now, we're talking about 4.1.6. We talked about two clauses of ISO 13485. This is directly impacted by your QMS software 4.1.6, which is also integral part of your software validation. That's when you then also have to have worksheet looking at functional tests. You look at code, which can be reviewed by the peers of the programmer for structural testing for spreadsheets with VBA scripts. A user manual or maybe a work instruction could be written how to use the spreadsheet, and then developing a protocol, and then the user loads the spreadsheet onto the computer and then tests the spreadsheet and document the results. So basically, when you do a validation of a spreadsheet or qualification, you would do it in the same way that you would do an equipment. You would have expected results and actual results. You'd have sometimes it's useful when you're doing this type of testing and software validation is to do screenshots or screen grabs. And software validation also applies to, I mean, the example that you've given here is Creo validation, Creo software. There can also be QMS software. It can be used for data collation or testing software. There's lots and lots of different software which is used, even building software as a medical device, which is using a software platform, is in itself a QMS system which is being used. So almost, if the thing about software as a medical device, and this is something I have to also indicate, because there's lots of software as a medical device rather than traditional medical devices going through a process flow where there's actual physical equipment and physical devices. Medical device software is typically digital software which has been used. Think of it as a virtual platform. The way to think about the manufacturing process, if you have extrusion lines or injection molding lines, in the same way you might be using Confluence or Atlassian or GitHub or GitLab or one of these other tools that you use to develop software, we also have to think of that as the virtual manufacturing space. And that's the thing that is almost in parallel with a manufacturing work environment, which is for hardware. For software, it's the platforms that need to be tested. And that is also governed by clause 4.1.6 of the ISO 13485. So final points, just to wrap up. In summary, software validation provides objective evidence that a software meets its intended purpose and functions correctly in its target environment. The software validation process then ensures that software code has been debugged and fixed where appropriate. Essential safety checks and functional checks are done, and any potential risks associated with the system have been identified and mitigated. The system is then safe, effective, and reliable, and then a lean approach is adopted in compliance. So that's all for today. I'll